Every time someone opens Clip Studio Paint for the first time, especially for animation, the same questions come up again and again. What's the best canvas size, DPI, output frame, folders, color coding, etc. So I'm going to show you my full template setup, the same one that I use for my own anime series, from beginning to end. A lot of people ask me how I set up my files specifically, so this is my setup. There are other ways of doing this, but this is what works for me and for my anime series. Quick note before we start, for animation with more than 24 frames, you're gonna need Clip Studio Paint EX. Clip Studio Pro caps you off at 24 frames or 1 second per animation file. So if you're on Pro, everything in this video still applies, just know that you'll hit certain limits and you won't be able to do anything longer than 1 second. So you just open up Clip Studio Paint for the first time, and the first thing most people say is that the interface feels kind of cramped. There's a lot going on, there's not enough space to draw on, and so on and so forth. And honestly, on an 11-inch iPad like what I'm using, I get it. There are menus everywhere, there's the layers panel, there's the tools, palettes. None of it is immediately obvious where anything is or why it's there. So I personally recommend customizing your workspace so that you have more room to do things. So in my case, I have moved all of my panels over to the right side, and I've actually minimized everything as much as I can so that I have the most drawing space possible. Everything is moved to the right because I am left-handed, so having it on the right keeps my drawing hand from covering things or clicking on things accidentally. I've also minimized most of the panels that I don't need open constantly. You don't need every single panel visible at all times, and closing the ones you're not using immediately gives you a lot more canvas space to work with. The one panel that I do make sure to keep active as much as possible is the timeline. You can actually find that if you go to Window and then click on Timeline. Depending on what I'm doing, so let's say I'm sketching a rough sketch, I usually keep it minimized, but if I'm focusing on the animation, I do want to have this open, maybe minimize as much as possible. That way I can not only see what I'm drawing, but also see things play out by moving the cursor left to right. The next thing I do is pin my essentials to the command bar at the top. To do that, you click on the Clip Studio or the menu icon and go to Command Bar Settings, and from here, you can actually customize your command bar. You can drag in your most used tools, your main pen and pencil, eraser, curve tool, selection tool, lasso, everything that you possibly could need up in one space. That way you don't have to keep hunting through the different panels to try to figure out what you need. This is also where I pin a lot of my main colors. So if you go to the command bar settings, you can actually go to drawing color, select the color that you want, and it'll get pinned to the top. Also, if you have access to remotes like the 8-bit Do microcontroller, this numpad which can be used for Procreate or Clip Studio Paint, or something like the Toolbox Elite Plus for iPad, or basically any kind of device you can map shortcuts to, that changes a lot of things, especially for iPad users. Rather than trying to click on certain things like the panels or trying to reach over and click on the things on the top, you can actually map a bunch of shortcuts and brushes and keyframes and a lot of other things to your macro pads or your keypads. That way you just click on a button and you get a different tool. You can map things like undo and redo. You can map things like change canvas rotation, flip the canvas, swap tools. Having some sort of remote or keypad or numpad really does help with using your iPad. So once the workspace is set up, let's actually create the file. So we're gonna go to File, and then New. So under the projects at the top, you'll see this little video player icon, which is for animation. Once you click on that, you are going to see the basic setup of an animation file. So you've got your width, height, and resolution, and you've got things like the overflow frame and a lot of additional settings. Now, this is where a lot of people get confused. You're gonna see all of these settings and you're gonna wonder what the heck they mean. The main thing you wanna focus on is your output frame. So in this case, I've got it set to 1920 by 1080. This is your standard HD frame, the same format as basically every TV, anime, and YouTube video that you've ever watched. The DPI, or resolution, you can actually set to something low like 72. Now, I know how that sounds, but here's the thing. A lot of people will say you want as high a DPI as possible, but that actually makes the file size extremely large for no purpose whatsoever. DPI only matters for print, as in paper printing. For screen-based animation, the only thing that matters is your pixel dimensions. A 1920 by 1080 canvas at 72 DPI and a 1920 by 1080 canvas at 300 DPI export the exact same video. It's all based on pixel dimensions and frame ratios, not DPI. Next, you want to make sure that overflow frame is checked on. You can actually see in the preview there's a little blue rectangle here, and then there's some extra white space outside of it. You can see on my screen here what the default values look like. Basically, the reason that the overflow frame exists is that the extra space is for camera movements. So if a shot pans or zooms, the camera needs somewhere to go outside of the main frame. So you basically draw past the borders of the output frame, and that allows you to actually move the camera in post without worrying about the image cutting off at a random spot. Now, if your shot has no camera movement at all, you technically don't need it, but having it there is good practice and keeps your files consistent with how production files are structured. For the timeline settings at the bottom, I recommend having the frame rate to 24 frames per second. Playback time and scene number and everything, I just kept it at the defaults, so this is just what I have. If you hit OK, you're going to see what the actual canvas looks like. So you've got this box here, which is the output frame, and then you've got the overflow frame outside of that. You can actually see an example as I draw on here. You can draw outside of the frame, you can draw inside the frame, and so on. Anything drawn inside this rectangle is what gets exported as your final video. Anything outside it gets cut off. So if I were to draw something like this, where it's like the neck and the head of a person, you can actually see where it'll get cut off. And so the actual output frame would be more like this, as opposed to showing the entire rest of the body. One thing that's worth knowing here, if you export your animation as a video or a GIF, only what's inside the output frame gets exported. But if you export as an image sequence or individual cells, Clip Studio actually exports the entire canvas, including the overflow area. So if I go to File, Export Animation, Image Sequence, you can actually see I have the option of exporting the output frame, the overflow frame, or the entire canvas. So keep that in mind when you're choosing how to export things. The next thing that I want to do is import my Genga template. Before I do that though, if you don't have one yet, the Clip Studio Tips blog has an official post where several Japanese animation studios have shared their actual production templates as free downloads. I'll put that link on the screen right now. Once you have a template image ready, go to File, and then Import, and then select your image. So in this case, I have it saved in my Files app, so I'll go to File, Import, Image, and then I scroll down and find the template. And you can see here it imported it into the project. This is just an example template that I got from the Tonari Animation YouTube channel before that rebranded, but you can pretty much find any of these from Google. So essentially, what I am using here is a digital version of the standard anime production paper. You've probably seen this if you've ever watched any behind the scenes footage of an anime studio. It has the main black rectangle here for the frame, title area, the cut number, shot number, and also the peg holes that are used for the physical paper. That is pretty much a standard layout across most templates that you're gonna find. So once it's imported, I'm gonna go to the paper layer and I'm actually going to change it to like a darker gray, just so that I can see the difference between the white background and the paper. This just makes it easier to visually separate the canvas background from the actual white Genga template while I'm positioning things. This is totally a personal preference. You don't have to do this. This is just a me thing. So I've got the paper selected, and then I'm just going to go in and size the paper up. Now you'll notice I'm trying to match this rectangle with the output frame from the Clip Studio project. So I'm just gonna drag down until that matches a little bit, drag this up so that it matches, kind of position things a little bit here. And now you can see I've matched the rectangles as best I can. So now once that's aligned, I'm going to adjust the canvas size so that it matches the paper. I'm gonna go to Edit, Change Canvas Size, and I'm gonna physically drag these points out so that I can actually put this together. So you can see it's a little bit wider than the actual thing. So I'm gonna go to Edit, change canvas size, adjust it down until it roughly matches the edges of the paper. Let's bring this up. Let's go over to the corner here. Drag that in. That's pretty good. Once everything is aligned, we basically have our template set up. Now this is as close as possible to the basic anime template as you can find. So we can draw inside of here and actually export things within this frame. We can also add titles, cut numbers, and shot numbers and notate things as a real anime studio would. Oh, the last thing you want to do, and make sure you do this, is to select that paper layer and lock it. That way you don't accidentally draw on that layer. So really briefly, I want to touch on something that I mentioned earlier. So the frame rate of the project is set to 24 frames per second. That's the standard for anime and film. Now, whenever 24 FPS gets mentioned in terms of anime, a lot of people will start to say, oh, anime is actually at 8 or 12 frames per second because it's drawn on 2s and 3s. That is technically correct, but the overall project is still set to 24 FPS. On 2s and 3s just refers to how many frames each drawing holds inside the 24 FPS container. The project frame rate doesn't change, so 24 FPS is correct. So now we're actually going to start building out the layer structure. And this is the part that I think makes the biggest difference in keeping your files organized, especially when you're working on a longer project. What I do is I separate each stage of the anime pipeline into its own folder. So in this case, I'm going to have a folder specifically for layout, key animation, in-betweens, and so on and so forth. Again, this is specific to my process or to the anime process, but you can pretty much set up these files exactly how you would. So you can say rough animation, you can say cleanup and tie downs, you can say final export. Doesn't really matter as long as you are focusing on what works for your workflow. Inside each of these folders, I'm going to create animation folders for each individual layer. So in this case, we would have a separate animation folder for layer A, which is going to be the layer furthest from the camera and sitting at the bottom. We'll have another one for layer B, and so on and so forth. Each layer is its own animation folder, and it can contain any number of drawings. So let's use layer A as an example. I'm gonna make sure that layer A is selected, and I'm gonna press this button here for new animation cell. And as you can see, it created a new layer. I can do this a couple of times. So let's say we have one here, and one here. I go to frame 1, I draw something here, go to frame 2, draw something there, frame 3, draw something like that. And I can move the cursor and it actually cycles through the different frames. However, that is not specifically how I set up my folders. So this is what I actually do. I actually have a folder that I set up as my animation cell. So I'm gonna create a folder, I'm gonna go down to layer A, and I'm gonna link it to number 1. So now inside of this folder, I can actually create a layer structure. So in this case, I'll have this as the line art. I'll have this as the flat colors, and I'll have this as the red and blue lines. If you want to know more about this, I'll explain a little bit more in detail later, but I do have a full video about this. So if you want to click on the video in the card or in the description, go check that out. Keep in mind that this is not the only way of doing things. This is just specific to how I do it. I actually have another animator friend who has a different template that I'll show you right now. So this is a project file from my friend Hanayo Sora, and you can see that there are actually a whole bunch of different animation folders for different things. So zooming in here, you can actually see that they have a line art layer, a layer for shadow and highlights, a layer for colors, timing charts, etc. And so you can actually set up your folders in a lot of different ways. It doesn't have to be one folder with a bunch of folders inside it. You can actually just have these layers all on top of each other. And as you can see, I can actually hide the colors layer so you can see the line art only, or I can do the opposite and hide the actual line art and show the colors and the shading only. Keep in mind that neither approach is wrong or right. If you need to export your line art and colors as separate files, separating them into their own animation folders makes it a lot easier. If you want everything for one character part bundled together in one place, you can have the cell folder stack approach, which works better for that. Either way, the purpose purpose of this is to find a folder structure that works for you. So remember I mentioned that we are pinning colors to the top of the command bar? Let me explain why I use these specific colors. In anime production, the line work is divided by color to tell the coloring department what each line means. Black is your standard outline. So this is for line art. This is for any lines that show up in the actual production, or things like the edges of characters, the edges of hair. Blue typically marks shadow boundaries. And so if there is a shadow on a character, it usually gets drawn in blue. Sometimes it gets filled in with like a light blue color. Other times it gets filled in with like a green or a pink, depends on the production. But the main thing to focus on is that it is lined in blue. Red typically marks highlight boundaries. So anytime that there is a highlight on a character, anywhere that the light is hitting the character or something is shiny, it is usually marked like this. I personally use yellow to fill it in, but again, depends on the production. This is pretty much the standard across a lot of different anime productions. And then there are additional colors like green or yellow-green for things like hair gradients, eye color division, or decorative pattern boundaries. You've got things like pink or dark purple for shading hair. Basically anything that needs a third type of color that is not a red or blue line typically is covered by something else. Not to mention, there are multiple studios that have their own systems for each of these, so I'm not going to tell you that there's one universal rule, but the most common conception of this is black for the line art, red for highlights, and blue for shadows, and then everything else depends on the production. Now here's the part that I actually want to show you because this is a trick that makes animating in Clip Studio a lot easier. So I'm going to expand this a little bit so you can see this a little better. This is the typical folder structure that I have for each animation cell. The top layer is going to be for line art, the bottom layer is going to be for the red and blue lines, and the middle layer is for the colors. What I do is go into each of these specific layers and look for the layer color option or the change layer color option. So let's use the black line art, for instance. I'm going to go into here and then adjust it to black, and then change the subcolor, adjust it to black. Now, no matter what color I choose, it is always going to color black on that layer. No matter what I do, it's always going to be colored that way. And you can actually separate this out into two different layers if you want. So let's say I want to separate this into red and blue. So let's take this blue layer, so let's change it to blue. I'm going to copy the hex code here so we can just keep things consistent. Layer color, paste in the hex code, subcolor, paste in the hex code. And now, no matter what color I draw on this layer, it is going to be that same blue. Similar for red. I'm going to go into red, copy the hex code, change the layer color, red, 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 and so on. I'm pretty sure you can tell where I'm going with this. So no matter what color I pick, I can just make sure that I'm selecting the right layer, and I can go in and draw, and it's going to be that color. That way I know that all the black lines are going to be on this particular layer, all the blue lines are going to be on this particular layer, all the red lines are going to be on this layer. You never have to think about it while you're animating, you just have to click on the correct layer and then draw. You can also add or remove color trace layers depending on what your project needs. So if you need a layer that has green, you just add another layer, change the colors, and there you go. This is just what works for my setup. All right, so now that the template is built out, let me show you how to actually start animating inside of it. So make sure you're clicked inside the correct animation folder. In this case, I'm under layer A, and we're gonna draw something. So let's say we have a ball here. So we got a circle. Nope. We're gonna do a circle. That works. And we're gonna give it a shade and a highlight. Doesn't have to be perfect, we're just going here. Now, when you want to move to a new frame, you just move the cursor over and then hit the add new animation cell. And what this actually does is it creates an entirely new folder structure using the same structure that you set up earlier. So you don't have to go back into change layer color, add all the black, red, and blue, and so on. You've already set up the structure. So every time you hit plus, it just adds a new folder with the same structure. Makes it super easy. So let's go over to frame number 2. Make sure that we're drawing on the correct layers. So we're gonna make a circle again, blue line, we're gonna change that here. red line, change it here. And the last one, same thing. Make sure we're doing black on the black line art layer, blue over here, red over here. And just keep on going until you animate your entire animation. So as we move through the stages of animation, let's say you're done with the rough layout and want to move to key animation, you go into the next animation folder up, create a new animation folder, label it A or whatever. You go to the previous folder and you just lower the opacity. So now you can see I have a faint outline of what was underneath it. I go in, create a new cell, and then I can just start drawing. I'm just using red as an example, but you get the idea. You can just trace over things and continue onward from there. The beauty of this is that each stage builds on the last without destroying it. It still exists as its own layout folder, so you don't have to worry about it later on in the process. It'll still be there, even if you're going into key animation, into coloring, and so on. You're keeping a rough draft of the previous step in the same file. And that is pretty much the core of how my animation process works. You literally just build the template from the ground up, and then you create each stage of the process as its own separate folder and build up from there. Once you have everything set up the way you want it, go to File, and then Save As, and then you want to save it as its own Clip Studio format. So in this case, make sure Clip Studio format selected, change the name, so template, and then hit OK. And you can actually choose where on your iPad to save it. In this case, I have it set into a Clip Studio folder inside of my iPad's file apps. From there, you can import it into Google Drive, share it with collaborators, or open it on another device because it's literally just a template file. What I personally do is I keep a templates folder with all of my different templates inside of it. So whenever I start a new project or I start a new shot, I copy the template file into the project folder and work from the new copy. This way, the original template stays untouched, and that's why I don't have to ever build anything from scratch. I already have a clean version ready to go. And that's basically how I set up my animation template from start to finish. One quick thing before I let you go. If you need a Genga template to import, like I said, the Clip Studio Tips blog has an official post where several Japanese anime studios have shared their actual production templates as free downloads. Or you can just go to Google and type in anime keyframe template and look in the images, and you'll probably find something that looks like this. And if you want to know more about how I set up my full Clip Studio workspace on my iPad Pro in more depth, check out the video on screen now. Thanks for visiting the Mind Palace, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.